Hi everyone. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Dirk and I'm currently at the University of Wisconsin doing my PhD. That is also where I'm based now. So I think my presentation is scheduled for around 3 a.m., 4 a.m., something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-record this just to make sure that it makes sense. And the presentation itself is giving a look at some of the work I do involved with the Tibetan NGO organization based in Dharamsala, India, amongst the diaspora community there. We run an immersion school, and that's where we work to bridge the gap between the modern speech variety that's spoken there in India and the West more broadly, and the literature of the classical texts. In particular, often it's Buddhist texts that date to around the 12th century. So one of our philosophies is that even for classical languages, speaking a modern variety of that language, if at all possible, is a really important and foundational skill to have. That's for a few reasons. First and foremost, in a natural language context, speech is often what ties languages to meaning. So if we think about what a language is at the fundamental level, a text, any text, even a classical text, is essentially encoded speech. Written symbols represent sounds, and speakers generally recover the meaning of a text by decoding it phonetically, even in silent reading through the process of subvocalization, and then interpreting that meaning through the language's relation to the mental imagery. In this simple example, we have the text symbol, APPLE, decoded as the sound, apple, which brings to mind, the sense imagery of an apple, its form, its shape, its color, or even its taste and smell, your prior experiences with apples. So for example, there's a visceral difference if I say crisp, juicy apple when you compare it to the sense that you get if I say mushy, wormy apple, right? So one of the points of starting with a modern spoken language is kind of building up some of this core vocabulary as it relates to core experiences to bring this sort of level of meaning to the language. Another good reason would be the social aspect of language. That is, when we build these meanings that are based on sets of shared experiences within specific cultural contexts, there are many non-orthographic features of language that speech provides that a text on its own does not. That includes simple things like prosody and the rhythm of speech, where to make pauses, gestures, social cues, cultural knowledge, context knowledge, and assumed world knowledge, among other social and cultural aspects of language. And while this all sounds well and good, one of the questions you might be asking yourselves, does it work? And are we justified in taking this approach? Now, broadly speaking, Tibetan in the university context is a field dominated by traditionalists, specifically philologists, who take their methods and approach from the classicist traditions that stem from Latin and Greek and were later applied to Sanskrit, and due in large part to the overlap of Buddhist content in the texts. The Sanskritists are, I think, the first that apply this grammar translation pedagogy, our teaching method, to Tibetan. And grammar translation is still the dominant method used for Tibetan in the universities to this day, and many other contexts. Of course, you are probably familiar with this method that dates back to the 16th century and relies on rote memorization and word-by-word translation, and then kind of puzzling out the meaning basically within English using grammar rules. So whatever the case may be for the other languages that use grammar translation as their main approach for language teaching, the application to Tibetan seems dubious to me. For example, if we look at a timeline of classical Tibetan, we see that Tibetan is actually much more comparable with English than other languages that we call classical, be it Latin or Sanskrit, for example. That is, it is about 1,000 years or so removed from languages like uh, those that I just mentioned, and the variety of Tibetan that we call classical dates roughly to the 11th century, with the final language standardization councils headed up by the translator Lochen Rinchen Zangpo, and the dates for his life are approximately 958 to 1055. The years of textual production that follow are contemporaneous with Middle English and early modern English periods of English literature, and not the classical languages of antiquity. This fact is borne out if we do a basic comparison of vocabulary coverage, testing modern speech data against classical middle texts. In this case, I have taken frequency lists of common speech words across language levels. For example, the top 1,000 words by frequency for A2, the top 2,000 for B1, and so on. And then tested how much of that vocabulary covers a reference corpus. In this case, we see a very similar distribution in vocabulary coverage between English and Tibetan. That is, a B1 level language learner should expect to know about half or 50% of the words that they read if they are reading a classical text. That is, the English learner at B1 would recognize about half of the words used in the King James Bible, is the example here. And a Tibetan learner also will recognize about half of the words used in the Kanjur, which is the Tibetan translation of the Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And then by B2, that coverage rises to 75%, which is pretty significant. Now, that's not enough for full reading comprehension, but it's a very good foundation, and we'll also be able to identify which words are non-level and thus far unknown by using corpus tools. And that way, we can supplement by setting targeted goals for the acquisition of literary vocabulary that will fill in the gaps and build up from this strong foundation in modern language skills. So, for those of you who may not have heard of corpus linguistics before, a corpus is nothing other than a large collection of texts in digitized format. And if we have this large collection of texts, we can ask computers to analyze them for us in interesting ways, and then use or apply that information either to answer a research question, as I did above, checking how much vocab coverage exists between different historical varieties of the same language, or, as I'll show in a bit, to inform how we teach a language like Tibetan. In this slide, I give an example of the frequency distribution of the top words used in Tibetan. In English, the top words would be things like articles, prepositions, common nouns, words like and, or to, that, or do. And it's very similar in Tibetan, with various adpositions, existential verbs, articles, and so on. An important thing to note here is that, as a diglossia, we see that modern literature looks a lot more like classical literature than it does modern speech. And here we have a slide of the same data, but from another view, measuring the relative frequency by word rather than rank. Here, there are some interesting things to note, like the incredible frequency of the verb re in modern speech, which has risen from relative obscurity and is almost non-existent in classical literature. Meanwhile, other words have relatively similar use across varieties, like the adposition gi, called a connective in Tibetan, jalja, which might be somewhat comparable to the English of. It generally denotes things like possession or other kinds of connections. By analyzing large corpora like this, we can get a sense of the general differences between modern speech and Middle Classical literature, not only in vocabulary but also in grammar. And then we can use that information when we're designing our textbook materials or creating lesson plans to suit different students' different levels, or to target particular structures or features that are prominent in literature, but that the student might not know yet from their foundation in modern speech. Or, if we're teaching specific texts, we can also use corpus analysis to help us identify words that come frequently in that text, the context that they come in, or the words they tend to come with, collocations. So in the above slides, I've talked a lot about frequency. That's because one of the most powerful applications of corpora is simply the computer's ability to quickly and easily provide us with frequency counts, frequency analysis. How much do words reappear in a text or a set of texts? This helps us focus in on providing students with frequent words that make up the bulk of the language. And this builds a solid foundation of words that they're going to hear and see again and again, and that they'll gain exposure to, or words that they'll use again and again in speaking and writing, that is, that they'll have practice producing. So exposure and production, two of the main parts of learning a language. Targeting frequent words for vocabulary acquisition ensures that students will have the best chance to understand the biggest parts of the text. And once they understand most of the words they're reading, the likelihood that they'll be able to kind of fill in the gaps with the more rare words is more possible and more probable. Frequency lists also allow us to analyze and grade texts, as well as edit them to suit particular levels. The more frequently a word appears, the more people know it and the more people use it. And the more it's used, the easier it is to learn. Here, we apply frequency lists within an editor developed by Asukya. We are able to highlight the words by level so that editors and writers can quickly and easily identify the difficult words or the level inappropriate vocabulary, and give a text a grade or a level based on the vocabulary it contains, or edit it so that they can have it suit a lower level, for example. Here, the level words are coming in green. Level 1 words are coming in green. The level 2 words are coming in yellow, and level 3 words coming in red. So that's A1, A2, and B1. This software also allows us to upload user-defined lists. So we could, for example, create domain or genre-specific frequency lists to target things like Buddhist literature or even a specific text that we might be teaching. Then, as we use these methods to identify that vocabulary that the students are unlikely to know yet based on their level, but that come frequently in the domain or the genre in which we're working, we can then give them the most bang for their buck. That is, we can give them the frequent words that will be the most useful for taking the next steps towards fluent reading and writing. This will provide us with a good understanding of our target vocabulary for the level that we're working on. And we can create the materials that suit the students' needs in a Tibetan-only context, an immersion context, with a focus on attaining just the vocab item we're targeting, but in a context where they understand everything else that's going on and where they are confident and familiar. In this example, we have a set of flashcards from an Anki deck with a fill-in-the-blank on our left and a picture plus sentence clue on our right. The sentences are simple and level appropriate, but the target literary words that the students are studying in order to understand the graded Buddhist texts are the focus of these flashcards. Another example of bridging the gap between modern and literary is the collection of digital graded children's stories that we host on our website. In this example, I have a simple children's story, but it is translated into Middle Classical Tibetan. And the non-level literary words that are probably unknown by the student at that level are given a highlighted color, prompting the reader to click on them. And as they click on them, the text box pops up and reveals the modern spoken corollary. So basically translating from one variety of Tibetan into the literary variety. So by slowly building up vocabulary through things like extensive reading of level appropriate stories, in many different interrelated contexts where, reading comprehension is possible, uh, then the students can progressively gain a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of the language and have a lot of repetition and a lot of practice. Another example here on this slide is that we have the same story but told in multiple versions using different modes or varieties of Tibetan. This way, we can apply the best modern research-based pedagogies to the classical language learning classroom, giving students added benefits, features like cultural immersion, and the ability to converse and collaborate with native-speaking scholars. In Tibetan Buddhist monasteries today, we have so many great scholars of Tibetan Buddhist traditions and certain textual traditions as well. So down the road in their professional careers, perhaps as a professional scholar or academic or translator, a student with this experience will have, the modern spoken variety to use as a kind of lingua franca to communicate with these scholars who most likely don't know English, or if they do, they might not know English well enough to discuss something like Buddhist philosophy in English. So this kind of holistic and integrated approach also provides students with this comprehensive and natural ability to read and understand Tibetan in Tibetan. So in other words, they have direct access to the meaning without having to rely on solely the translation dictionary, or, just as we do in our native languages, we have the ability to read and understand a text without referring to some other language. Languages are built within their own worlds. So the result is an ability to identify something like, oh, this writing is beautiful or poetic, or, this author is trying to be humorous here or ironic, or other literary techniques, skills that are otherwise very difficult or impossible in literal word-by-word grammar translation contexts. In my final slide, I give a general overview of the outcomes of a modern translation training program, or a TTP, that draws on these ideas for Tibetan. This framework is inspired by the new and emerging field called translation studies, or translator training. And here, translation is taken as an end goal rather than a starting point or a pedagogy, a method for learning the language. So the goal here is that students are first building their language skills and their fluency in speaking and listening, and then in reading and writing. And alongside that, separately, the theoretical underpinnings of what translation is, what communication is, what issues exist in intercultural communication contexts, as well as linguistics, technology, literary and text analysis, other important subfields that they'll need before they finally apply it to the classical language context. So I think I'll end it there for now. Thank you for your time, and hopefully I'll be able to wake up at 3 a.m. and be available to answer any questions you may have.